So today I wanted to, as you might guess from the meditation, talk a little bit about thoughts and witnessing thoughts and working with beliefs, particularly our core negative beliefs. And it's very relevant to the discernment of heart wisdom because probably the factor that most distracts us from this inner knowing, our deepest inner knowing, are our thoughts and our beliefs, and particularly our belief in our thoughts, because thoughts are inevitable and they're not by themselves problematic. Now, I know this, what I'm going to be talking about is familiar to many of you, but it feels like such important foundational understanding. It's good to review, and perhaps for a few of you who are new to this, there may be um, something useful. So, thoughts are very seductive, if you haven't noticed. We tend to believe our thoughts, and we see the world. We actually create our image of the world through our thoughts, as well as an image of ourself, and very often unknowingly as well. So we rely on our thoughts tremendously to make sense out of the world and others and ourselves. Um, but our thoughts are very limited. Really, no thought is completely true. Some are more accurate than others in terms of corresponding with relative phenomena. But no thought is completely true. It's an interesting proposition, including that thought that I just shared with you. Right. So it's good to have a little space from our thought, and actually, it's good to have a lot of space from our thinking, and distinguish awareness from thought. Right. To distinguish awareness from thought. And it's very evident, it's very obvious in the simple formulation, I'm aware of my thoughts. Right? I'm aware of my thoughts. So awareness is there, thoughts come and go. Usually the awareness is in the background and unrecognized, and we're identified with our thinking. So one of the great pointing out instructions in this approach is that we are not our thoughts. And that's a good preliminary instruction. I mean, ultimately, we are everything, including our thoughts. But because we are fused and confused with our thoughts, it's good to actually recognize this awareness, which is separate from thought, and give our attention to it, to unhook, in other words, from our thinking. And probably the significant thoughts to be concerned about are our judgments, our judgment of right and wrong and good and bad. And this is something that torments many people, and I imagine some of you as well. Certainly, almost everyone I've worked with has had to deal with the inner critic and the judging mind in terms of how you think you should or shouldn't be, or someone else should or shouldn't be. So it's very interesting. The mind has this beautiful capacity to imagine different possibilities, right? To create virtual realities. And this allows us to be creative and is really, very important for imagination. But we also torment ourselves with it by creating ideals against which we never measure up. Has anyone had that experience? Right, raise your hand. Right, everyone, pretty much, at some point or another, myself included. We have this idea of how things should be, and particularly, and others, of course, but above all, how we should be. Right? There's some ideal, some standard against which we measure our actual experience. So there's always a gap between the actual and the ideal, if you've ever noticed. I share this mundane insight because it was so important for me to get this some years ago. right? Between what my actual experience was and some imaginary ideal against which I was measuring it, and the sense of inevitably failing to meet that ideal. So, what would it be like actually to accept our experience as it is without judgment? And of course, the judging mind can't do that, right? It's sort of an impossible task for the judging mind to be accepting unconditionally. But something in us, interestingly, does. That really, it's not judging, and that's our true nature. That's awareness. So, it's a great freedom to be liberated from the tyranny of shoulds. And you can do it whenever you're aware you're shoulding on yourself, yeah, or should nodding on yourself. And as soon as you recognize that, you free yourself from it and you come back to zero. You come back to your actual experience and become intimate with your experience. This is the point, really, the important point. As you recognize and free yourself from the tyranny of the ideal, the tyranny of the should, the tyranny of the judging mind, you become intimate with your experience. And that's what this retreat is about, intimacy. Judgment always creates separation. Byron Katie, with whom I studied many years ago, would say only 100% of the time. Right? Judgment always creates separation. It's a very powerful insight. Check it out for yourself. Whomever we're judging, we feel an inner distance from. And whatever we're judging within ourselves, we also feel distance from. And so it creates a kind of barrier of intimacy with our own experience. So in my work with people, and I've done one-on work in depth with people for almost 40 years now. um, I've really honed in on the importance of recognizing core negative beliefs. Sometimes we're aware of them consciously. Very often they're subconscious. We're not very aware of them, and we know them by their effects. They're embedded in the body, and they affect our feelings, our emotions. It's like when we're getting triggered emotionally, almost always, not always, by the way, because it can be the formation of strong contractions and emotional reactions can actually developmentally happen very early on before there's much cognition on the part of a child. So if there's very early attachment and trauma issues, um, core beliefs are secondary to that. It's going to direct impact on the nervous system and the body. But early on, very early on, we begin to create templates, schemas, patterns of the world and ourself. And they begin as we gain more language and understanding, they turn into beliefs. And then they become stronger and stronger and turn into core negative beliefs. And they have tremendous power. So it's really helpful in this process of self-discovery and self-trust that we recognize core negative beliefs as they arise. We don't need to go digging for them. Then we get caught in a self-improvement project. But but be aware of them as they arise, and often they'll arise as a kind of somatic contraction, something we feel in the interior of our body as a kind of gripping, also as an emotional reaction. And that's a good way to start, actually, in discovering what our negative beliefs are. is actually body sensing. Let ourselves have the emotional reaction. Let ourselves feel the somatic contraction for a couple of minutes. And often, interestingly, that kind of sensing, that willingness to feel and sense, allows a kind of letting go to happen just by paying attention. But sometimes it won't. In which case, it's very interesting to ask, is there a core belief, you ask yourself, associated with this? By the way, what I'm talking about now, I've written a chapter in my book In Touch about. So if you're interested in kind of going over it in more detail, that would be a good source. If you have the book, just to read it again, read that chapter. To just ask yourself, what's the belief? Is there a belief that's associated with this somatic contraction or emotional reaction? And be quiet. And very often, a very simple belief will emerge, like something's wrong with me. I'm unlovable. I'm a failure. Usually, it's very short. A few words, 3, 4, 5, 7 words, not longer. And you can feel it. It has a kind of impact. When you have the thought, it kind of reverberates in the body as a contraction, as an emotional reaction. We'll feel the emotional reaction like sadness or anger or shame or terror, and somatic contraction. We'll feel it kind of collapsing in, a tightening internally. So these beliefs are embedded in the body, and they're quite potent. So I've developed a very simple way of being with them and inquiring that I found very effective that I wanted to share with you today. Some of you are familiar with this already. But once you're aware of what that core belief is, and by the way, beliefs tend to be variations on two main themes. One is that I'm flawed in some way, and the other is that something's missing. I'm lacking something. So the way I am is flawed or wrong, or I'm not enough. Often it comes out as I'm not enough, and sometimes both as well. They kind of dance together, these core beliefs, very often. So when you're aware of the core belief, and I would invite all of you for a moment just to kind of ask yourself if you have a troublesome negative belief that tends to emerge, or if you scan your body now and something is coming out. Notice if something comes up in the way of a belief. Kind of check for resonance. See if it's you've said it as simply and clearly to yourself as you can. Sometimes the wording is very important. Notice how you feel and what the effect in your body is. And then bring your attention to the heart area. Let go of the thought and ask yourself, what's my deepest knowing about this? And be quiet. What's my deepest knowing about this belief? It's not a question for the mind. You're asking your heart wisdom. What's my deepest knowing? So the response may not come as verbally. It may come more as a feeling a sense or a direct knowing, or it may come as a very simple word or phrase. And whatever comes, and this is very important, let it in. Notice what happens. So I want to open it up now, to share this little method of inquiry that can help us unhook from our core negative beliefs. And generally, it takes time. It's not as if one little session frees us entirely, but we begin to get space and around these very sticky and compelling beliefs that um, distract us actually from our heart wisdom and our deepest knowing. So I wanted to open it up um, and hear from you if you have any questions or want to follow up on this inquiry or any points about um, really this or anything else. So we'll open up the conversation now.